Hey everyone, welcome back. So I don't know if you know this, but I actually started playing Black Desert Online all the way back in early 2016. This was during the beta testing for the Western release of that version of the game. And let me tell you, I played it a ton. I sunk like a few hundred hours in those first couple of months. Now, since then, it has been one of the many MMOs that I like to revisit from time to time, jumping back in to just see what's new. And in the case of BDO, things have changed quite a bit over these past 7 years. While the base of the game had a lot that I really enjoyed between its combat, the life skill system, and the overall sandbox nature, instead of being sort of on rails, guiding you through an experience. It's kind of a game that once you figured it out and got your bearings, lets you just kind of do whatever you want. A lot of times it meant grinding and engaging in the combat, but since the combat's fun, the grinding in turn is also fun. But anyways, yes, I played a lot of BDO and I've gone back to it over the years as well because there's a lot about it that I really enjoy. However, there were at the same time and have been over the years some major pain points, especially around the monetization and quality of life features that you felt like you had to pay for. Mainly that was the thing. Without spending extra, oftentimes it sort of felt like you were at a bit of a disadvantage with things like the looting, carrying capacity, and storage space. Well, in addition to various other updates that have come to the game, adding a bunch of new content, continents, and characters to play over the years, they've also made some fairly big recently quality of life features, now offering for free things that they used to charge for in the past, which I just think has been like a major improvement and step up for a game that already had stuff about it that I enjoyed. So Pearl Abyss reached out recently wanting to sponsor a video. They specifically basically just wanted me to talk about their most recent content update, the Land of the Morning Light. Tell people about it, let them know what's up. And I am going to do that. I will get to the new stuff later in this video, but frankly, having revisited the game again, I'm kind of just interested in talking about those changes and the improvements that have happened over the years, almost as a PSA in case you have played BDO in the past or have kind of shied away from BDO, because I think the improvements they've made to quality of life for the low or no spenders beyond like the base cost of the game are a really nice positive change, a really good step in the right direction. And a lot of this has happened after the shift of separating from Cacao, their previous publisher, and Pearl Abyss now kind of being just off on their own. So before we talk about the new update, let's talk about the stuff that was kind of a pain in the past, but is much less so, if not a pain at all, in the current state of the game. So there were a few sort of pay for convenience things that cropped up in the early days, back when I first started playing those 7 years ago, and they were carried with the game throughout the years. And some of the main issues revolved around the silver, the inventory, the pet system, and the way the game handled costumes. So for the silver side of things, silver is the main currency in the game, and it had a weight associated with it, and it was really, really heavy. So basically what would end up happening is that as you're out there grinding for gear and materials and stuff, you're also accumulating silver, and you want that silver because you need it. It is that main base currency, but it weighed a lot and it would fill up your carrying capacity very quickly. And then once that capacity was full, you basically could just barely move. I mean, it was like a massive encumbrance to you. So the result was you would be constantly, regularly going back to town to deposit the silver into your town storage, or the other option was that you could buy a weight limit increase in the game's cash shop. Then also sort of along those same lines was how the inventory system worked. You had a set number of inventory spaces, they would fill up with items, and back then and through a lot of the lifespan, there was just very little stacking of those items. So sort of similar to the silver, this means that your inventory would constantly be filling up as you're out there grinding, which resulted in you having to go back to town to deposit stuff into your town storage, or you could buy in the cash shop the inventory expansion stuff. And then there was the pet system. So the way pets work in this game is it's not just like a cute little character to follow you around. It basically functions as the game's version of auto loot. The pets would manually loot stuff for you, or you would have to click on each individual enemy that you kill by yourself. Now, because this game it has a lot of focus on grinding and a lot of AoE grinding, where you're gathering up these groups of like 7 or so enemies and then using cleave and AoE attacks to bring them down and then moving on to the next. Well, if you had to constantly loot every single one of those enemies over and over again manually, this just creates a massive time sink and a big hindrance to like the efficiency of your grinding. And again, this is a game that a lot of the focus is around grinding, or can be around grinding. It can also be around life skills and doing the exploration, all that stuff. But make no qualms about it, grinding is a big part of BDO, and so when you had to manually click on everything, that was a big pain. So in the past, pets were basically primarily purchased in the cash shop. Free ones were rarely available and difficult to come by, and you would never get, like, it'd just be unreasonable to think you'd get the max number of pets but for free, because you could have 5 active pets at any given time, which pretty much meant that after you got your free one, you would be then purchasing the additional 4 in the cash shop in order to loot as quickly as possible, which, as we've reiterated, is pretty darn important. And then there were the costumes. So costumes are cosmetic outfits. They would sort of replace the visual appearance of your base gear, but much more so than that is they had associated improvements, things like extra experience gain, reduction to the death penalty, and even suits that would hide your nameplate in PvP, which would be a pretty big advantage in those open PvP zones. So those were some of sort of the biggest, what I would call, pain points in the playing experience that really sort of incentivized you to open up the wallet and step into the cash shop. And these major issues have pretty much entirely been addressed in recent years. So for example, silver in the game no longer has a weight associated with it. So you don't have to account for that anymore when it comes to reaching your weight limit. But on top of that, the weight of items that you pick up in the game has seen a reduction in its numbers in a lot of circumstances. So now not only could you carry more than you could previously, basically, you also no longer have to account for that silver weight. Similarly, with the inventory, many of those items that you're going to be out there grinding for now will be stacking instead of each taking up an individual space in your inventory, which greatly reduces the desire to purchase more inventory space. Same thing with the pet system. Free ones are now frequently available while playing. In fact, while playing through a season quest line, you're actually going to have access to more than the 5 cap that the game has. So you can get for free pets that you would in the past have to have purchased. And then as for the costumes in the game, well, they still exist and they still give their bonuses, but now can just be bought outright in the game shop with silver from other players who purchase it from the cash shop. So there'll be people out there spending real money to get these costumes, but then they will sell it to people who don't want to spend real money and instead want to buy it with in-game currency that they got from just playing. So these are some pretty big improvements. And then there's also a few other quality of life things that have come to the game, like the Magnet storage that makes it so that you can access the local storage from anywhere in the game without having to actually go to those individual towns. The game basically has localized storage where you'll have one town and a storage there. So if you're grinding, you go to that town, you put items in that storage. In the past, you would have to go back to that town and physically actually take it out yourself, or set up these trade routes, which would then take some time as items were transferred from one area to the other. Now with Magnet storage, you can just grab items from anywhere that you have them stored within the game. A massive quality of life improvement. And then there's also the contribution point system. A lot of players in the past, you have these contribution points and you'd acquire them throughout the course of playing. And then a lot of times you would want to focus on using them on workers. That way you could use them for things like gathering resources for you just passively. Then that would make it so that when it comes to things like storage in the town where you'd want to use and need to use CP for, people would then go to the cash shop. Well, now it's really just not as big of a deal. It's far less of an emphasis on that within the game. And because storage is now also not as big of a deal, if it's not as cumbersome, basically, there's a lot less of a incentive to actually have to purchase. Just all around, a lot of really positive but just a lot of really positive quality of life changes that have come to the game with recent years. And again, a lot of this has happened post the separation from their prior publisher, Kakao, into sort of doing their own thing, taking the reins on the game and how the monetization is handled. And all around, I think it just made for a much better experience for players. Now, there's definitely still some pretty big quality of life stuff that you can buy in the shop. There are things like the value packs, which will boost your inventory storage, XP gain, and a few other things. This is kind of just like a grab bag of different nice things to have. And then things like the campsites, which allow you to repair and buy potions out in the field instead of having to return to town. Although, to be honest, as new players, if you're just starting the game, you're going to get a few months of value pack buffs through the game's various unlocks. So it'll be some time before you feel the need to buy it. And the campsites will only really matter once you get into like the hardcore efficiency grinding, which at that point, if you're playing for a few months and you've used up all of your free value pack buffs and you're to the point where you're doing like end game efficiency grinding and needing campsites, at that point it's probably worth the amount of money, the $30 or so that you'll want to spend on those extra things. But as I mentioned, there are so many other layers that had you going to the shop or sort of pushing you towards the shop in the past, which are just no longer there. And these changes, along with others that have been made over the recent years, have just been really great in my opinion. And I just think because of that, the game is in a much better place than it's ever been. Now, as mentioned earlier, there's also a lot of other things about BDO that I've just always liked. I've talked about in the past in my various bits of coverage. But as a recap, I think it's got some of the best action combat in the genre, and especially with the input method that kind of reminds me, and it's always reminded me a lot of like fighting games. So basically, to play optimally, you'll use these combinations of inputs with shift, the directional keys, and left and right mouse click instead of just hitting the keybinds. So for example, to use an ability, while you could just hit number 1 on your keyboard, you click that, the ability happens, but instead there will be these input combinations. Like say one example is one of my abilities, I have to hold down shift and W and then left click, and then I can alternate that with a different input, and going back between these will combo. And all of this just makes for, because it's more involved, it makes for like a much more satisfying combat experience than just spamming 1 and spamming 2. And why would you go through this extra effort instead of hitting 1 or 2 to activate a skill, doing these inputs? Well, basically doing so will add benefits like increasing the damage and reducing the cast time and or resources of your abilities. So if you want to play efficiently and get the most out of your combat, you'll be doing these inputs instead of just hitting keybinds. And combat just feels great, and because the game has a big focus on grinding, you're constantly engaged in that combat. They've also got some rather in-depth and interesting life skill systems, which are basically the game's version of professions. You know, it's got the basic stuff like farming, fishing, cooking, and processing, but how they actually handle this with various mini games associated with them just makes them a bit more engaging. There's also all these management systems, that contribution point system that I mentioned earlier. You get these points and you use them to essentially manage towns, like increase the storage and pick your housing plots. You've got workers that you'll go out to harvest resources for you that you'll use for crafting food and things and buffs and all that, connecting trading routes between these different towns and ferrying items from one location to the other. It's also in a seamless, massive open world with no loading screens between the zones. There's very limited fast travel in the game, all of which I always felt has made for some great immersion. And the world is pretty populated. Obviously, you know, other players in the game, but also the density of enemies out in the field and towns that are full of NPCs walking around doing their different things. And finally, and this could be a positive or a negative depending on perspective, but the game basically has like infinite progression. There's a soft cap as you're leveling up, but you can kind of just keep on going. So if you feel motivated to reach like the maximum echelon of things, that could be a bit much. But for me, it's always been kind of freeing because I'm like, I'm not going to grind that out. So I'm just not even going to stress about it. I'm not worried about getting anywhere near any sort of cap, soft or hard or otherwise. There's just no rush. Over the years, basically for that reason, BDO has been one of my favorite MMOs to play casually, kind of going at my own pace, leveling up new characters, exploring, doing stuff, not super concerned about the end game grinding spots and competing for those in PvP. There's a big world. Combat's great and engaging, and a lot of fun downtime activities and systems to mess around with. And that's how I've always enjoyed BDO. So come back over the years to check out various updates, see the new content, try the new classes. As mentioned, Pearl Abyss was sponsoring this video because they wanted me to tell you about the most recent updates. So let's talk about that. Land of the Morning Light, the most recent region expansion to the game, first released in Korea back on March 29th, and we just recently got the global release last week on June 14th. Now this opens up an entirely new continent to explore. This area is inspired by Korea's last dynastic kingdom and featuring terrain, buildings, and vegetation that will be reminiscent of that era. Along with this, they're also taking a lot of inspiration from many legends and folklore of the time. Now, one big change with this update is, unlike previous new regions that would add a bunch of new endgame grind spots, this one's not focused on that. Instead, they've added various bosses with this boss rush system. So there's 9 different new bosses, each with their own mechanics and strategies to take on. Each of these will also have 10 different difficulty tiers, and as you move up those tiers, you'll be introduced to new mechanics and attack patterns that you'll have to deal with. There's also these new gathering mechanics called the Green Artisan Skills. These add new mini games to various gathering life skills that these will be triggering randomly as you're out there gathering in the world, and if successfully done, you're going to use some more energy up, but you will then can also obtain a larger amount of materials. There's also now the Marnie sniper rifle life skill, which adds various improvements to sniper hunting in the game, including dealing damage increased depending on the spot that you hit. So for example, the greatest damage increase comes from a headshot, probably not surprising, but there you go. And then the quality of reward will depend on your accuracy. In addition to this, some other new stuff includes new quest lines and a fully voice acted story. There will be new workers, materials, and nodes for you to find. All of this also accessible from level 1 if you're a brand new player. If you jump into BDO for the first time, you don't have to level up before you get to check out this new area and this new content. All of that combat, everything about it is just scaled to whatever level you are.
I'll say personally also, I just like how, just like with a lot of the prior content updates, Land of the Morning Light just brings some nice new additions to the game. Getting a brand new play space is always awesome. Obviously, a new place to explore. I think BDO does a good job with its open world, and it's been really cool to go around checking out the new region. I like that they're doing something a little different with the focus on boss battles this time around, instead of just adding new grinding spots for players. Some of these fights are really neat as well. I also really enjoy the gathering mechanics. I know it's simple stuff, but how BDO does life skills, I have always enjoyed. Sort of gamifying the process of gathering and crafting just makes it a bit more engaging. All in all, this update just seems like another great addition to the game.
So Land of the Morning Light, the latest update, as mentioned, is now available globally. It is free for anyone who owns BDO, or if you pick up BDO, you buy the base version of the game, Land of the Morning Light is just going to be available for you for free as well. So check it out. You can go ahead and take a look at the link in the description below. As with all of the major new content updates, it's cool to see the new stuff, but again, I am really just really happy to see some of those quality of life improvements that they've made to the game. It's a nice surprise having come back recently, seeing these changes from how it was when I used to play seriously, because they're just big improvements. You know, it doesn't feel like I am pressured into those things anymore like it sort of did in the past. If you wanted to play seriously, dealing with the weight of silver, dealing with feeling like you had to purchase those pets and weren't giving enough for free, dealing with the inventory with little to no item stacking, and dealing with the fact that costumes were almost a must buy. All of that stuff has been addressed, where you can just kind of play the game and with little to no additional purchases beyond the base version of the game, you can just play and enjoy it and kind of not feel moved in that direction. So yeah, I'm jumping back in. I'm going to be playing some more and checking out this most recent update. Happy to tell you about it though, because as mentioned, BDO is just a game that it's one of the many MMOs that I'll come back to on a regular basis. And yeah, I'm looking forward to jumping in, and maybe you'll see another follow-up video outside of this sponsored video here. See another one where I do some follow-up thoughts after playing some more of this update. But that's it for me today. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Take it easy.